If you've played even one season of fantasy football, you know how annoying it is to draft a fantasy bust after you've been talking the guy up to your league mates all offseason. Today, I'm going to try to help you guys avoid the same mistake I've made by outlining the 5 biggest busts in fantasy football this season. We're going to start off with A.J. Brown, veteran wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles. He's one of the most talented wide receivers in the entire NFL over the past few seasons, but I'm pretty skeptical of drafting this year in fantasy based on his ADP and the offensive situation around him. There are multiple high-end fantasy options on the Eagles, including Devonta Smith and even at times Dallas Goedert. Those guys all take targets away from Brown. And I'm not just talking about passing volume. The Eagles averaged the most rushing attempts in the NFL last season with 36.7 per game. That is over 3 more rushing attempts than the second place team. And like I said before, A.J. Brown is amazingly talented. He's one of the NFL's best wide receivers when healthy, and he was good last season in fantasy. But at his ADP, which is the middle of the second round, there are certain players with less competition that I would take above him. Those would be guys like Brock Bowers, Josh Jacobs, Bucky Irving, and Ladd McConkey. When you look at A.J. Brown's usage, his targets per game did drop after Barkley's addition to the team's offense in 2024. His targets dropped from 9.3 per game to 7.5 per game. You can give them the benefit of the doubt that he was injured last season, but it was still a significant drop. While his fellow Eagles wide receiver Devonta Smith only saw his targets drop from 7 per game to 6.8 per game. Not as big of a drop at all. The surplus of weapons in Philly's offense make it really hard to justify spending a mid-second round pick on A.J. Brown. Obviously, if he falls to the end of the second round, I think you could absolutely pull the trigger on him at that point, but right now at his ADP, I'm a little bit hesitant. I mentioned veteran tight end Dallas Goedert before. It looks like he may end up staying in Philly despite all the trade rumors earlier this offseason, and that takes even more targets away from A.J. Brown if Goedert ends up being healthy. All this to say, I think A.J. Brown could go over 1,000 yards once again. He is so good when on the field, but there are so many fantastic options in Philly's offense that he may not be the most usage-heavy player on the field at all times. Not to mention the fact that when they get inside the 5-yard line, the tush push or a run up the gut with Saquon Barkley is the team's most obvious plan of action. If you're looking down the board for value in fantasy drafts, guys that are going under A.J. Brown that will probably underperform him, but are better value in relation to their ADPs, I would look at guys like T. Higgins, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Tyreek Hill. Devontae Adams is another guy that could really outperform his ADP on the Rams this season. He was nearly a top 10 receiver last year, which is what A.J. Brown is being drafted at right now. The floor is there for Brown, absolutely, but the ceiling is what worries me for a second-round pick in fantasy. Next up, we have Patrick Mahomes, quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs, and before you jump to the comments saying that I'm an idiot for putting Patrick Mahomes on a list of fantasy busts, just hear me out. Mahomes is a great real-life quarterback, especially in the playoffs in clutch situations, but he has some limited upside in terms of fantasy value. His efficiency as a passer has not been very good the last few seasons, especially compared to his first few seasons starting in the NFL. Mahomes' past 2 years have seen a career low in yards per attempt, just showing that lack of efficiency in the passing game compared to the earlier parts of his career, and this year was his worst. He posted 6.8 yards per attempt, which was nowhere near the top of the league. And when you're looking at a guy being ranked as the QB 5 or 6 in fantasy drafts, it really isn't worth it. I mean, I'm looking at guys like Baker Mayfield who put up way more passing touchdowns, Bo Nix and Kyler Murray who have a lot more rushing upside, and I'm not seeing the argument to take him over those guys, even though he's ranked above them in many rankings. Again, Mahomes just doesn't have the rushing upside of the guys ranked behind him. That's one of the top things I look for in a fantasy quarterback. Can he get me rushing yards to add on to that passing production? When I look at guys like Nix or Murray who outpaced Mahomes by a lot in rushing yards last season, I don't see the argument. Mahomes has also not flashed in the box score the past couple years. He's had less than 30 passing touchdowns and more than 10 interceptions in each of the past few seasons. So paired with that rushing upside is a lack of passing touchdown production, and his average depth of target metrics over the past 2 years are also a career low. Overall, Mahomes is a low ceiling, high floor quarterback option, but I just cannot justify taking him in the first 5 rounds of fantasy drafts. Let me reiterate, I think Mahomes is a really good real life quarterback, but I'm just not going to take him on any of my fantasy teams this year. If he can't put up the passing stats and the rushing stats don't back him up and support him in any way on a game-to-game basis for fantasy points, I just don't see the point in it. The offense just hasn't been as efficient as a whole over the last couple years, although with Rashee Rice coming back from injury as Mahomes' top wide receiver, he could see a bit of improvement in that area, but I just don't think it's going to be as big of a swing as many are expecting to put him into top 5 quarterback in fantasy conversations. I think Patrick Mahomes is a borderline top 10 fantasy quarterback this year. He is definitely not worth his ADP, but if he falls, you should definitely select him. If you guys are enjoying the video, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this every week that could help you win your fantasy league. Next up, we have Mark Andrews, tight end for the Baltimore Ravens. Compared to his pre-2024 production, Andrews was fairly uninvolved in the offense last year. At least that was until towards the end of the regular season, where he did find his stride and put up some seriously good fantasy production. But things were looking really bad for Andrews over the first 5 or 6 weeks especially, where he just was not putting up any points at all, and he was being dropped in a ton of leagues. I mean, you can see it in some of the production, especially in some of the advanced stats. He had a career-low 88% route participation, which for a tight end that thrives off of a lot of receiving work, that's not looking good. And things wouldn't be looking so bleak if Isaiah Likely weren't waiting in the wings to take a ton of receiving production from him. Over the past 2 seasons, Mark Andrews has barely averaged over 600 yards per year receiving. He's been kind of carried by how many receiving touchdowns he's gotten, which to his credit is really impressive. And he does have the best quarterback in the league throwing him the ball, so I'm not too surprised by that with how good of a connection they have. But if the Ravens decide to get the younger, Likely more involved in the offense than he already is, Andrews could see his volume fall even more. Obviously, Ravens fans already aren't very happy with Mark Andrews after his crucial drop in last year's playoff game that ended their season. And I'm not saying he's going to fade into total irrelevance, but John Harbaugh has been praising Isaiah Likely this offseason, saying that he could break out this year. When you look at Andrews' receiving stats last year, you don't see a ton. I mean, his best game receiving-wise was 68 yards. He didn't have a single game with double-digit targets. It's not looking good. These past 2 seasons have been a far cry from his 2021 and 2022 days. On top of this, wide receiver Zay Flowers took a massive step forward last year, and Rashad Bateman, the other wideout, signed a multi-year extension this offseason. Those guys are here to stay in a bigger part of the offense, I think, maybe than Andrews. Obviously, in the red zone, it's a different story, but if he sees any kind of touchdown regression, he could be in for a major slide in fantasy value and be one of the biggest busts in all of football. The tight ends I like at ADP that are being drafted below him are kind of just all the guys ranked directly behind him. It's David Njoku, Tucker Kraft, Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland, and Evan Ingram. Obviously, that's not in any kind of order, but just the guys I think that have better value at ADP than Andrews does. Moving on to our next player, we have Joe Mixon, running back for the Houston Texans. And yes, he did have a very solid year last season in his first season with the team. He put up over 1,000 yards and had 11 rushing touchdowns. He did, however, see a significant drop in usage as a receiver, and more running backs were added to this backfield this offseason. Woody Marks was selected in the 4th round of the 2025 NFL Draft out of USC. He could definitely see some volume as a receiver this year, but even some as a rusher too, which would really hurt Joe Mixon's value. The team also signed Nick Chubb, which I get it, he's far from his glory days because of that really bad knee injury, but there's nothing stopping them from still using him on the goal line because he is still a pretty big running back. Not that Joe Mixon isn't a capable receiver or goal line back, but they've brought in guys that can fill those roles, so maybe it's more of a committee backfield this year. After all, he's getting towards 30 years old. They want to keep him healthy, especially if they make a playoff push. On top of this, the offensive line for Houston wasn't greatly improved after a really bad 2024 season, and that could hurt Joe Mixon's fantasy value if they aren't able to run block either. While I'll admit that last bit was a stretch, what's not a stretch is how inefficient Joe Mixon was when he returned from injury. And on top of this, I'm just not a big fan of his ADP. He's going in the 3rd or 4th round in a ton of drafts. There are plenty of guys like James Conner, Quinshon Judkins, and Dave Montgomery that I prefer over him who are being drafted later. Overall, I'm very skeptical on Joe Mixon's fantasy value this year with more backfield competition and a not great offensive line. Moving on to our last player, we have James Cook, running back for the Buffalo Bills. And if you really didn't look at the stats very hard, you could say he had a way better year than last year. However, he did regress in terms of carries and rushing yards. He logged 30 less carries in 2024 than in 2023 and barely cracked 1,000 rushing yards. However, he was used a ton on the goal line with 16 rushing touchdowns, which is an insane amount. However, that sets him up for touchdown regression if he's not able to repeat those numbers, and his fantasy value could fall. He was also used significantly less as a receiver once Ray Davis was drafted to the Bills last year. This really affects his PPR value, not to mention the fact that I really like Ray Davis both as a receiver and a rusher, and I would expect him to eat a little bit into James Cook's work this year. I mean, I literally have on my notes, Ray Davis is a dog. I don't know how much more direct you can get than that. So James Cook had way less volume in 2024, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of people talking about that because of how many rushing touchdowns he got, inflating his fantasy value. And the reason I'm even more hesitant to draft him than usual is the elephant in the room, the contract dispute he's had with the Buffalo Bills pretty much all offseason. He wants a new contract, and a pretty pricey one at that. $15 million a year is his demand, and that would make him one of the highest paid running backs in the entire NFL. Guys that are being drafted after him that I think have more value in relation to their ADP are Kenneth Walker III, Amarian Hampton, and Chuba Hubbard. Drafting any of those three would be a massive win in value to your fantasy team. That's all I got for you guys today. Feel free to comment below your thoughts on the video. I would love to talk ball with you guys in the comments. But for now, I'm Joe, and this is Fantasy Trading Room.